Okay, let's talk about the environmental influences on our development. Um, it's easy for us to say that our environment is just about the ways that we were raised, so what our parents do to influence us into becoming who we are. But it's more than that. It's our prenatal environment, it's our experiences that we go through, our peers, our culture, and even our gender that all influence who we are becoming, right? So our environment is more than just our parents and our immediate environment. It's everything around us. So let's talk about some of these environmental influences. The first one is the prenatal influence. So um, our nurture, our environment doesn't just begin at birth, it begins in the womb, right? If your biological mother takes drugs, has an illness during pregnancy, has excessive amounts of stress, all of those things can influence the way that you are developing. We call these things teratogens. Teratogens are external influences on a developing fetus, things like alcohol, drugs, stress, um, medication, et cetera, et cetera. Our experience also influences our development. So um, we've talked about this idea before, that idea of if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So we need to use the parts of our brain in order for them to develop properly and to develop um, into the mature connections that we need. And one of the studies that has showed us this is actually done with rats. When rats, there were two different groups of rats. One group of rats was put into a really stimulating, enriching environment. Another group was put into an isolated, deprived environment. And what they saw is that rats who were in the enriched environment, they developed heavier and thicker brain cortexes. So the idea is that those neural connections are stronger in an enriched environment. And this seems to hold true for children as well. So infants who are handled more or like held more seem to gain weight rapidly and develop faster neurologically. So again, it's operating on that idea of if you don't use it, you lose it. Peers also influence the way that we develop. We have this idea called the selection effects. Kids tend to choose friends that are similar to themselves, at least in the important ways, things like our values, our manners, our personalities, right? We tend to choose people that are similar to us. And this is because nature predisposes us to do this. We spend a lot of time with our peers, and so we want them to be similar to us because we want to be able to stand them, right? To be able to spend time with them. Um, Parental and peer influence, though, seems to work hand in hand with each other, complementary to each other. Our parents influence parts of our development, things like our education, our responsibility, the ways that we interact with authority, and then our peers influence other parts of our development, things like our sense of cooperation, popularity, and then how we interact with other people our age. So our parental influence and our peer influence, they work hand in hand together to develop us into a fully functioning human. Okay, culture and how this influences us. First, we need to know what culture is. Culture is all of the behaviors, ideas, attitudes, traditions that are shared by a large group. We know that cultures differ, right? Our culture here in the United States differs from that of people in Asia. However, we can look at it smaller too. Our culture here at CMH differs from that at Waukesha West. And within these cultures, we have a set of norms. Norms are those rules of accepted and expected behavior. And when we go somewhere that's not our culture, these different norms tend to confuse us. Some of the most popular or things that are come to our mind really easily are things like personal space, um, our level of expressiveness, so how much we show emotions, and then how fast we go through life, our pace of life. All of those things are based on norms within one's culture. Culture also influences our child rearing, so how we bring up children. And we have collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures. Individualistic cultures are Western cultures, United States, Canada, most of Europe. These are cultures that want our kids to think for themselves. They want them to be independent, be true to yourself. They value their own personal goals. Whereas collectivist cultures, which are like Asian countries, a lot of African countries. This is more communal. They're working for the common good. If you bring shame upon yourself, you also bring shame upon your family. And you don't tend to work a lot with strangers, right? You're more with your family. However, just because there are differences doesn't mean there aren't similarities. There's a lot of similarities among cultures as well, but we do tend to see some differences. Okay, gender. Gender can be looked at from the nature side and the nurture side. So let's look at nature first. Nature, genders are genetically different. And in this case, we actually would call gender our sex, right? Our biological sex. So in nature, a male is genetically different from a female, right? The X versus the Y chromosome, and then those signal the production of different types of hormones in our body. The nurture side, so gender is also socially determined. So the gender roles, the expectations about how a man and how a woman behaves, those are created by our culture. And they vary from culture to culture, as well as over time, right? Like the expectations of a woman in the 1950s is different from the expectations of a woman now. Those are gender roles. Our gender identity is also socially determined. So gender identity is our sense of being male or female. So how you identify yourself. We tend to gender type. So we acquire masculine or feminine roles based on our society, but it doesn't always happen that way. So you acquire your gender identity because of the society that you are in, okay, and because of those gender roles that our society has. Okay, so our traditional gender roles. So females are expected to be shy, very passive, nurturing, dependent, dainty, emotional. They're also expected to depend on men in their lives when it comes to sex. They're expected to be naive and passive, and they're expected to comfort and care for their husband and children and be that homemaker, right? Males are expected to be leaders, independent, take control, make the decisions, be more physically strong. They're expected to be the breadwinner of the family, as well as the head of household. And then they are supposed to take the initiative when in a relationship with a woman. So these are kind of those traditional gender roles that our society puts out there. Does everyone fit this? No. Do we for sure have these still in society? Yes. So how does gender happen? How do these gender roles come about? How does someone come up with their gender? Well, there are a couple different theories. The first one that we're going to talk about is the social learning theory. This is the idea that children learned gender-linked behaviors by observing and imitating other people, as well as through rewards and punishments. So this is the big thing, rewards and punishments. So a young boy who is playing with a doll and then gets scolded by his dad, they're learning by observing their dad as well as by being punished for playing with the doll, right? So not necessarily based on the messages that children get from their parents, as research has shown, that even if parents discourage traditional gender roles, children often organize themselves into these traditional gender roles. So the problem is that our society is rewarding and punishing children so much, and it can be subtle, that even if parents discourage these traditional gender roles, children often still organize themselves into these traditional girls and boys roles. Okay, and then we have the gender schema theory. This is the idea that we are taking social learning theory and we are adding in cognition. So this is more than just we learn by observing, we learn by rewards and punishments, right? That's very passive, that it's just kind of happening. Gender schema theory adds in cognition. So we think about it. We learn from our cultures as a concept of what it means to be male and female, and then we actually think about it and decide to adjust our behavior accordingly. when you compare yourself with the concept of gender, okay, remember a concept is our idea in our mind, that set of um, our concept is the big idea of being a male or a female, and then our schema is those lists of characteristics. You then change the way that you act to fit that schema, okay? So if you see this on a test, you're always going to want to see that idea of the child thinking about what they are doing, about what they observe about a gender, and then making a decision to do something. So it's the idea of, okay, a boy has a choice between taking a sewing class and taking a martial arts class. Johnny thinks about it and then decides that it is better for him to take the martial arts class because it is more for boys. Okay, that's the idea of the gender schema theory.